For almost 100 years, we believed we had counted them. The giant figures carved into the Nazca Desert of southern Peru, the hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, drawings so large they only make sense from the air. A few hundred of them, mapped by hand over 3 generations. That number felt final. But in 2024, a team fed the same desert to an artificial intelligence built by IBM, and in 6 months, it found hundreds more that every human eye had walked straight past, and the smallest ones were never meant for the sky at all. The desert itself is the first clue, and for almost 100 years, it pointed everyone in the wrong direction. The Nazca Pampa is a red-brown plateau in southern Peru, more than 400 square kilometers of flat, stony ground, where it almost never rains, and the wind barely stirs. The people who lived here 2,000 years ago made their marks in the simplest way imaginable. They lifted the dark, iron-stained pebbles off the surface and exposed the pale soil underneath. And because the rain almost never comes, and the pushed-aside stones piled into tiny walls along each groove, the marks simply stayed. A hummingbird with a beak longer than a football field, a monkey with a spiraled tail, a spider, a condor, a killer whale. Stand next to one of them on the ground, and you see almost nothing, just a shallow path in the dirt. Climb into a small plane, and the same scratches snap into a perfect animal. That single fact, that you have to be above them to see them, is where the whole mystery was born. The first person to study them seriously was a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Zespe, who spotted them from the surrounding foothills in 1927. A decade later, an American professor named Paul Kosok stood in the desert at sunset, watched the sun drop exactly along one of the lines, and called the place the largest astronomy book in the world. Most of the figures were cut by the Nazca people around 2,000 years ago, though a few of the oldest belong to an even earlier culture, the Paracas. That same dryness is why any of them are still here. With almost no rainfall to erase them and barely any wind to bury them, the shallow grooves have kept their shape for 2 millennia, which is exactly the trap that swallowed everyone who studied them. The figures were preserved so perfectly and spread across so much empty ground that the desert could hide its faintest drawings in plain sight for 100 generations. And everyone who came after was left holding the same impossible question. If these were made to be seen from the sky, then who exactly was supposed to be looking? For the next 50 years, the person who tried hardest to answer that question came to it from an unlikely direction. Maria Reiche was a mathematician from Dresden in Germany who arrived in Peru in the 1930s, working as a translator and a tutor. She met Paul Kosok while helping put his research into English, saw the lines for herself around 1941, and then simply never left. What she did with the rest of her life is hard to overstate. She mapped the figures one by one, by hand, filling notebooks with measurements. She swept the lines clean with a household broom so they would not vanish under drifting sand. She hauled a stepladder out into the pampa and climbed it, just to see from a few extra meters what the Nazca had somehow designed for the sky. She paid local guards out of her own lecture fees to keep tourists and trucks off the fragile ground. In 1976, she helped fund a tall metal viewing platform beside the highway, so travelers could look down on a few of the figures without walking across them, and her own sister Renate helped pay for the work. Peru eventually made her a citizen and gave her the Order of the Sun, and the guides who fly visitors over the desert today still call her the Lady of the Lines. When she died in 1998, at 95, they buried her in the desert she had spent 5 decades defending. And here is the part that matters for our story. Reiche counted the figures, and the total she and everyone else arrived at settled at a few hundred. She also spent years fighting a single idea with everything she had, insisting the lines were made by human beings, by the Nazca, tied to their pottery and their gods. But by the time she was buried, most of the world had decided she was wrong. The idea that beat her filled a hole the science had left wide open. For a while, the leading explanation was the one Kosok and Reiche both believed, that the lines formed a giant astronomical calendar aligned to the sun, the moon, and the stars. But in the late 1960s, an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins ran 186 of the lines through a computer and tested them against the positions of the sun, the moon, and the stars across the centuries. He found no more matches than random chance would produce. The calendar idea quietly fell apart, and into that empty space rushed something far stranger. In 1968, a Swiss writer named Erich von Daniken published Chariots of the Gods, and in it, he offered an answer that was impossible to forget. The lines, he said, were a landing strip. The long trapezoids scraped into the pampa were runways for alien spacecraft, and the tall figure carved into a nearby hillside, the one with the round helmet-like head that people still call the astronaut, was a portrait of one of the visitors. Two things made the story spread. The first was the quiet assumption that ancient people could not have planned something this large and this precise on their own, which is both wrong and, if you sit with it, faintly insulting to the Nazca. The second was harder to argue with. You genuinely can only read the figures from the air, and if they were made to be seen from above, the reasoning went, then surely they were made for someone who could get up there. Von Daniken did not even invent the airfield idea. A writer named James Moseley had floated it back in 1955, but von Daniken carried it to the world, selling close to 70 million books, and decades later, the television series Ancient Aliens brought the Nazca Runway to an audience that had never heard of Maria Reiche. Strip the whole theory down to its foundation, though, and everything rests on one load-bearing claim: that the Nazca Lines were built to be seen from the sky. Hold on to that, because a machine is about to test it. The machine belonged to a partnership between Yamagata University in Japan and the research arm of IBM. The archaeologist driving it, Masato Sakai, had already given more than 20 years of his life to Nazca, and he had run into a wall. The only way to hunt for new figures was to sit and stare at high-resolution aerial photographs of a plateau bigger than 400 square kilometers, square by square, hoping to catch a faint shape the eye wanted to skip. It was slow, and it missed things. So Sakai's team went to IBM's Thomas J. Watson Research Center outside New York and asked their engineers to build a deep learning model, an artificial intelligence trained to recognize the visual signature of a geoglyph. The problem was that there were only a few hundred known figures to learn from, which is almost nothing for this kind of training. So the engineers cut the known geoglyphs into smaller pieces to stretch the examples further. Then they pointed the finished system at the aerial imagery of the entire desert. What came back was a map of possibility. The AI flagged 47,410 candidate shapes. The researchers screened those down to 1,309 that looked genuinely promising, and over a single 6-month field season, they drove out into the Pampa, walked 341 of those locations, and confirmed 303 figures that no one had ever cataloged. The work on the ground was brutal. Confirming what the system flagged took the team more than 2,600 hours in the field, driving, walking, and photographing with drones, and the AI was nobody's magic wand. On average, researchers had to check around 36 of its suggestions to turn up one figure that was actually real. But even at that ratio, the speed was staggering. Sit with the scale for a second. It had taken close to 100 years of patient human searching to document the first 430 figures. This system helped find that many again in half a year, lifting the rate of discovery roughly 16 times over. And Sakai's team called it a genuine turning point in how this kind of search gets done. This was not even the first time the approach had proven itself. A few years earlier, a smaller test run of the same idea had already surfaced a handful of new figures, including a humanoid and a pair of legs stretching more than 75 meters across the ground. That trial was the proof of concept. The full 6-month campaign was the machine let loose. But the count was only half the story. The bigger shock was sitting in what the machine had actually pointed everyone toward. The new figures fell into 2 families. The larger ones, the line-type geoglyphs, are mostly wild animals stretched along the network of long, straight lines and trapezoids, and they mostly confirmed what researchers already understood. But the system's real gift was for the second family, and this is where the story turns. These are the relief-type geoglyphs, and they are small, averaging around 9 meters, low to the ground, and worn down by time. They are almost impossible to pick out from a plane, which is the whole reason a century of aerial photography had walked right past them. And when Sakai's team looked closely at what these small figures actually showed, 3 things stood out. And together, they quietly take the alien theory apart. The first is their scale, because these are human-sized drawings rather than the vast ones that made the runway story feel plausible. The second is where they sit. Instead of commanding the open plain, they cluster along the narrow winding footpaths that thread across the desert, an average of about 43 meters from a trail. The third is what they actually depict. Where the giant animals sprawl across the pampa, these small figures show people and the things people cared about. Human figures, severed human heads, domesticated llamas, and scenes lifted directly off Nazca pottery. One of them is a 22-meter killer whale clutching a knife, a motif Sakai ties to Nazca ceramic art that shows orcas carrying out human sacrifice. The wider catalog reads like a record of Nazca life. A humanoid figure gripping a club, a 2-headed snake swallowing 2 people, fish, birds, cats, and again, human heads. There is even a detail that had been hiding inside the alien story all along. That tall hillside figure the believers named the astronaut is one of the very few geoglyphs you can see clearly from the ground, because it sits on a slope facing you. It was never alien evidence. Archaeologists read it as a human figure, a god or a shaman, carved on the hillside so the people below could look up and see it. Line all of this up and the entire premise flips over. These figures were not carved for something staring down from the sky. They were carved to catch the eye of a single person walking past them on the ground. They were made for people on foot, close enough to touch, moving through the desert at eye level. If you want more of these, the ones where the official story quietly comes apart under new evidence, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making them. Now, if these figures were made for people walking the desert on foot, that opens the real question. What were they walking toward? And what were the drawings trying to tell them? The clearest answer arrived in 2025. Sakai's team announced another 248 figures pulled from surveys guided by AI, and that pushed the running total of figurative geoglyphs to 893. With that many finally on the map, something new became visible. Not in any single drawing, but in how they were arranged. The small figures followed specific paths across the desert, and those paths were grouped by theme. One trail is lined with scenes of human sacrifice. Another follows a run of wild birds. Another gathers the domesticated animals. Walk a chosen path on foot, and the figures reveal themselves one after another, in sequence, the way panels reveal a story. The desert was not one enormous message pinned up for the sky to read. It was a shelf of separate stories, each one meant to be taken in slowly, on foot, step by step. And the paths themselves were not accidents. There is more under them than ritual. The anthropologist Johann Reinhard argued for decades that the lines were bound up with water and fertility, and some of the long trapezoids sit directly over buried veins of water. In a place that barely sees rain, the Nazca dug a system of spiral wells and underground channels called puquillos to pull water to the surface, and dozens of them still work today. The straight lines, meanwhile, run toward Cahuachi, the great ceremonial center where the Nazca gathered, and many appear to trace the pilgrimage routes that led people there. Cahuachi was a place people traveled to for ritual, a destination that drew pilgrims from across the region, and the lines read like the roads of that journey drawn into the earth. A pilgrim walking one of them was following a route the Nazca had shaped on purpose, figure by figure. The two kinds of figure even seem to have been meant for different eyes. The giant animals along the Great Lines were public, sized for whole groups moving together toward the temple, while the small trailside figures were close-up drawings a single traveler or a few companions would come upon as they passed. This is the picture the evidence keeps pointing toward. The Nazca were shaping sacred ground you crossed on foot, ground that told you stories and pointed you toward water and toward the temple at Cahuachi. The alien story did not quietly retire. In 2023, a Mexican showman named Jaime Maussan carried what he called 2 alien bodies into a hearing at Mexico's Congress and claimed they had come from the ground near Nazca. A Peruvian forensic specialist named Flavio Estrada later examined seized versions of the figures and found they were dolls, assembled out of animal and human bones and held together with modern synthetic glue. What Estrada said afterward lands as the point of this entire story. He stated plainly that Peru's ancient cultures built Machu Picchu, that they built the Nazca Lines, that they needed no help from anyone to do it, and that the people promoting the alien version were doing it for money. This was not even the first version of the stunt. Maussan had pushed nearly identical bodies back in 2017, and an earlier analysis of one of those found its head was largely the decayed brain case of a llama. Same desert, same claim, same answer from the scientists every time. Then, in January 2026, Erich von Daniken died at the age of 90. The timing is hard to ignore. The man who sold the world on the Nazca Runway passed just as a machine was pulling the ground out from under the premise it stood on. But the figures face a real threat now, and it has nothing to do with the sky. In May 2025, Peru's Ministry of Culture moved to shrink the protected Nazca Reserve by roughly 40%, a change that would have opened the land to mining. After a wave of anger at home and abroad, the ministry reversed itself a little over a week later, on June 8th, and put the full protection back. UNESCO noted that it had not even been formally told. Hundreds of small-scale gold miners already work the edges of the site, and Sakai himself has warned that some of the geoglyphs are now in genuine danger of being destroyed. The ground has paid for human carelessness before. In 2014, activists walked onto the pampa to lay a banner beside the famous hummingbird and left footprints across ground that had been untouched for centuries. In 2018, a truck driver plowed across the lines and gouged deep scars through 3 of the figures. And the main coastal highway still runs straight through the site, cutting across one figure's outstretched hands, with traffic passing over it every single day. For 2,000 years, this desert held its figures perfectly still, waiting for us to learn how to look at them properly. A machine has finally shown us how. The only question left is whether we will keep the desert intact long enough for it to finish telling the story we are just beginning to read.